introspection entirely. The only way for you to overcome cheat is to confront the disorder head on and acknowledge the 5 stages of white racial grief that you experience as you grapple with the presence of black folk and the history they created, and the very way they have changed American society. You are often stumped by feats of black competence, or you display a tolerance for blackness that slides quickly to condescension. There is resistance and rage too. There is anger at the refusal of the other to cave into whiteness, to see history, American history, the way you see it. Anger at our refusal to curtail black agency. During the 80s and 90s and the ballyhooed canon wars, you were fit to be tied when a writer like Toni Morrison, who should have been recognized long ago for her genius, finally got her due as an American master. It upsets you when black folks say that white history dressed up as American history is not a perfect picture of reality. Beloved, white racial grief erupts when you fear losing your dominance. You get mighty angry at our demand that you live up to the sense of responsibility you say others should have, especially black folk and people of color. You often tell us to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to make no excuses for our failure, and to instead admit our flaws and better ourselves. And yet so many of you, beloved, are obstinate to a fault, intransigent and thin-skinned when it comes to accepting the calling out you effortlessly offer to others. Donald Trump is only the most recent and boisterous example. The first stage of white racial grief is to plead utter ignorance about black life and culture. It seems impossible to pull off, but many of you appear to live in what the late writer and cultural critic Gore Vidal called the United States of amnesia. When black folk get in your face, or even just expect you to know a little about black life, to take the past into account when speaking about black life, your reaction is often simply to forget it. It is a willful refusal to know. So often many of you claim no knowledge of black life, as if it never played a role in your world or made a difference to your existence. But it is no less distressing that you can so easily dismiss the history of a people you share space and time with as you both carve out your destiny together on the same national geography. It is not unlike those explorers and pilgrims who discovered America, that is, discovered a land full of native people. Native lives stop mattering before they ever begin to count. The historical erasure of blackness strengthens this racially blind version of American history, makes it easier to make the argument that black folk never did a damn thing for the nation. Iowa Congressman Steve King wondered in 2016, where in history are these contributions that have been made by these other categories of people? Where did any other subgroup of people other than whites contribute more to civilization? King said that Western civilization every place where the footprint of Christianity settled the world. Let's be honest, my friends. This kind of sentiment is far more widespread than you may care to admit. It makes one thing clear. Black and white folk are often speaking different languages with no common frame of reference, and therefore no possibility of understanding each other. Thus, the crudest conclusions possible in American history have stuck to black life. Black folk are often seen as simians at the high table of culture, aping white society. This poisons public discourse, leading to white condescension, if not worse, in the public media. Talented New York Times columnist David Brooks lectured black folk about the need for an open display of patriotism by discussing the Founding Fathers as moral exemplars without ever mentioning that they owned slaves. That's amnesia with a bang, or really a fang, an exposed snarl at the inconvenient messiness of real history. Real American history is the sticky web in which black and white are stuck together. Stop trying to pretend that you don't know this. You can kill us, even brutalize us, but history makes escape from us impossible. An even greater fear lurks barely beneath the surface. What horrifies many of you is that America, at its root, has been in part made by blackness. God forbid, but it may in part be black. Slavery made America a slave to black history. As much as white America invented us, the nation can never be free of us now. America doesn't even exist without us. That's why Barack Obama was so offensive, so scary to white America. America shuddered and said to itself, the president's supposed to be us, not them. In that light, Donald Trump's victory was hardly surprising. The one-drop rule, the notion to racial purists that even a speck of black blood contaminates one's heritage, has always signified that white America believed that blackness was superior. Even the slightest presence of black blood was able to overcome and outsmart whiteness. Blackness had to be taboo because it couldn't be vanquished or destroyed. Blackness feels like a curse to your view of history. White America, you deliberately forget how whiteness caused black suffering. And it shows in the strangest ways. You forget how you kept black folk poor as sharecroppers. You forget how you kept us out of your classrooms and in subpar schools. You forget how you denied us jobs, and when we got them, how you denied us promotions. You forget how you kept us out of the suburbs, and now that you're gentrifying our inner city neighborhoods, you're pushing us to the suburbs. You forget that you kept us from voting, and then blamed us for being lackadaisical at the polls. Although it sounds delusional, perhaps more than a few of you feel the way Donald Trump's former campaign chair in Mahoning County, Ohio, Kathy Miller, does. If you're black and you haven't been successful in the last 50 years, it's your own fault, Miller said. You've had every opportunity it was given to you. You've had the same schools everybody else went to. You had benefits to go to college that white kids didn't have. You had all the advantages and didn't take advantage of it. It's not our fault, certainly. She also said, I don't think there was any racism until Obama got elected. Think of how the members of the House of Representatives, influenced by the Tea Party, opened the 112th Congress in 2011 by reading out loud on the House floor the Constitution in its entirety. Except they didn't read the entire or the original version, which included Article 1, Section 2, which says that black folk equaled 3/5 of the white person. The representatives lapsed into calculated forgetting. That sort of behavior is not limited to the mostly white men who make up our Congress. It bleeds into the general population as well. How many high school social studies textbooks, like the one prepared for use in Texas, forget racial terror by downplaying slavery and barely mentioning segregation, presenting a seamless transition from bondage to freedom? Toni Morrison, in her great novel Beloved, replaces memory and forgetting with rememory and disremember to help us think about who or what the nation chooses to remember or forget. President Donald Trump chose Make America Great Again as his 2016 campaign slogan. It sounded the call to white America to return to simpler, better days. But the golden age of the past is a fiction, a projection of nostalgia that selects what is most comforting to remember. It summons a past that was not great for all. In fact, it is a past that was not great at all, not with racism and sexism clouding the culture. Going back to a time that was great depends on deliberate disremembering. One of the great perks of being white in America is the capacity to forget at will. The sort of amnesia that blankets white America is reflected in an Alan Bergman and Marilyn Bergman lyric sung by Barbra Streisand. What's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. The second stage of grief flashes in the assertion, it didn't happen. Instead of forget it, there is deny it. Civil rights icon Joseph Lowery often says that we live in the 51st state, the state of denial. Denial is even more sinister than amnesia, because there is some concession to facts that are then roundly negated. Here is where the gaslight effect goes wild. Black folk are made to feel crazy for believing something they know to be true. Beloved, you must admit that denial of fact, indeed denial as fact, has shaped your version of American history. This is how you can ingeniously deny your role in past racism. You acknowledge that bigotry exists. For instance, you will often say that separate but equal public policy was bad. You just don't find too many current examples of the persistence of racism. Like the fact that, given they have the same years of education, a white man with a criminal record is often more likely to get a job than a black man with no record. Or that even when they commit the same crime, black folk are more likely to do more time than a comparable white person. Or that a black male born in 2001 has a 32% chance of going to jail, a 1 in 3 shot, whereas a Latino has a 17% chance and a white male a 6% chance. Or that black women are far more likely than others to be evicted. Or that police stop black and brown folk far more than white folk. Or that black folk are frequently illegally excluded from jury service. Sure, there are no white and black water fountains, but inequality persists. White denial thrives on shifts and pivots. It was my ancestors, not me, who did this to you. But what looks like confession is really denial. The them, not me defense denies how the problem persists in the present day. It is best to think of systems and not individuals when it comes to racial benefit in white America. Thinking of it in individual terms removes blame from many of you who are present beneficiaries of past behavior. The institutions of national life favor your success, whether that means you get better schools and more jobs or less punishment and less jail. Not because you're necessarily smarter or better behaved, but because being white offers you benefits, understanding, and forgiveness where needed. A great deal of white advantage has nothing to do with how you actively resist black success or the success of other people of color. It's what you do for each other, how you take each other into account, that makes up a lot of what we have come to call white privilege. When it comes to race, the past is always present. What Jim Crow achieved in the past through, say, redlining, where services like banking, insurance, healthcare, and supermarkets are denied to specific racial or ethnic groups, continues to this day. Formal segregation in housing policies may have been struck down, but steering, where real estate brokers direct home buyers toward or away from particular neighborhoods based on race, is as effective as ever. School segregation is no longer the law of the land, but classrooms today are depressingly resegregated. Yet no one is responsible. All we hear is the refrain from reggae star Shaggy's hit, "It Wasn't Me." We end up with what social scientist Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls racism without racists. My friends, if you simply look around and reflect on even recent history, you'll see that denial shows up in painful ways, even among young folk. A recent study by the Public Religion Research Institute shows that 56% of millennials think that the government spends too much on black and minority issues, and an even higher number think that white folks suffer discrimination, and it is just as big a problem as that suffered by black folk and other minorities. Or those white youth wonder why they don't have a white entertainment channel to match BET. In the political realm, look at the Supreme Court in its Shelby versus Holder voting rights amendment decision. The court struck down the requirement to get legal permission to change voting practices because it concluded such permission was no longer necessary. The court denied the primary reason for recent black voting success, the existence of the rule for preclearance, where a jurisdiction covered under the law cannot change voting procedure without written approval from the Department of Justice in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Now they were throwing it out because the very success of the rule counted as evidence that it was no longer needed. It was a nifty and nasty bit of circular reasoning that denied the facts. Can you not imagine how this sort of reasoning makes us just a little bit crazy? How it makes us think that white folk are hell-bent on denying how much the past is still with us? Black folk were successfully voting because they were being protected. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg torched her conservative colleagues with blistering eloquence. She argued that throwing out preclearance, the Section 4 formula, when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes, is like throwing away your umbrella because you are not getting wet. That's just one example of why Ginsburg may be black folks' favorite justice since the death of Thurgood Marshall, despite calling Colin Kaepernick's protest of police brutality dumb and disrespectful, an issue I'll take up later. Instances of denial clutter the landscape. Fox News channels such denial nightly. I'm distressed to see the right-wing network blaring from the television screens in the restaurants of hotels I stay in when I'm on the road in states like Ohio or Florida, places where working class and poor whites don't fare so well, and yet they cling to the racial fantasies of going back to a time when they ran things. But just as it was true when, say, Ronald Reagan was in office, working class whites and their poor kin won't benefit from the economic policies of the conservative politicians they depend on to diss black people and other minorities. What they gain from not being seen as black, they lose in real economic terms. It's a Faustian racial bargain. The third stage of white racial grief, appropriation, looms everywhere. If black history can't be forgotten or denied, white America can simply take it. Appropriation is a tricky symptom of white racial grief, and one that, ironically, defers to black culture even as it displaces it. White culture bows at the shrine of black culture in order to rob it of its riches. White America loves black style when its face and form are white. Rachel Dolezal, former president of the NAACP in Seattle, Washington, caused quite a stir when she lied about her racial identity, which was white, and claimed to be black. She was eventually forced to leave her post at the NAACP. Dolezal didn't feel that her white identity should in any way still the heart of blackness that beat within her. White Australian rapper Iggy Azalea mimicked the dialect of the hood in America to cash in on the desire to have white hip-hop stars equal the achievements of their black peers, much like the truly great Eminem. Eminem has paid homage to hip-hop culture with extraordinary talent and hard work, just as Justin Timberlake does with rhythm and blues, except in the case of Timberlake, he picks and chooses his way through blackness. He's black at awards time, not so much when it comes to taking heat with Janet Jackson over their controversial halftime Super Bowl performance, in which he tore off part of her clothing at the end of their act. Timberlake proves that cultural critic Greg Tate is right. Such white stars want everything but the burden of the blackness they sample. The credo of appropriators is, "It happened to me too." Blackness, that is, but not its costs or penalties. Moreover, these stars claim an outsider status without actually having to be outsiders. The novelist Lionel Shriver threw an opening salvo in the newest installment of the Writing Wars to determine who could say what about whom. Shriver dropped her bomb in 2016 when she addressed the Brisbane Writers' Festival and rode herd on her free speech horse against political correctness. Millennials and the generation trailing them are especially vulnerable on this score, Shriver argued, because they are in a race to see who can be more righteous and aggrieved, who can replace the boring old civil rights generation with a spikier brand. As Shriver sees it, the left has become all too nervous about living in the skin or brain or experiences of the other. The demand that folk write only about what they know or experience is utter nonsense to Shriver. It is suffocating orthodoxy that imperils the art of the novel. Otherwise, all I could write about would be smart alecky 59-year-old 5'2" white women from North Carolina. It's easy to empathize with Shriver. After all, if you only write what you know, then you are left with precious little to write about. Shriver's argument, however, fails to see how other cultures, their people, their ideas, their identities, have always been treated as only fiction, have always been looted of their inherent value and forced to fit into the schemes, worldviews, or novels of folk, especially white folk, who were invested in denying their own privilege and power to treat these other cultures just as they pleased. When Shriver talks about free speech, she gets the speech part right, but she only sees free from the perspective of the person doing the writing, not the one being written about. Shriver, as a white writer, is quite free to roam across the globe in search of whatever experiences or insights will light her way to a nuanced, engaged piece of fiction. But that freedom is not merely artistic. In fact, her art, the art of white writers, rests on power relations that have left black culture at a disadvantage, vulnerable to literary cherry-picking. Shriver's grumbling is dressed up as the will to free expression, which should characterize the art of writing in any truly liberated culture. But underneath her gripes are a body of ideas and identities that have been abused and appropriated against the will of other cultures, and used at the discretion of writers who pay no mind to the people whose experiences they seek to borrow. Those people of color, for instance, have been cogs in the cultural machinery of white writers. Of course, the writer's purpose might be a good one, such as telling a story that hasn't been told, but if the folk whose story is told don't have the opportunity to tell their own story, what is on the surface a good thing becomes a matter of who has the power and privilege to spin narratives. We must also not overlook how the use of such experiences can reinforce beliefs about communities of color that have harmful political consequences, such as William Styron's controversial novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner, which painted Turner as a man more obsessed with violent sexual lust for a blonde teenager than political rebellion against slavery. Nor should we ignore how the appropriation of minority cultures by white writers with a political advantage leaves people of color little room to speak their truths in their own ways. And we certainly can't ignore how the more famous members of your tribe often get angry when they're called on their appropriation. Fashion designer Marc Jacobs used candy-colored Etsy dreadlocks on mostly non-black models in his 2016 fashion show, provoking ire and outrage. Critics claimed he trafficked in the worst sort of racial appropriation. Jacob shot back at all who cry cultural appropriation or whatever nonsense about any race of skin color wearing their hair in a particular style or manner. Jacobs displayed great insensitivity and ignorance when he argued that it's funny how you don't criticize women of color for straightening their hair. The reason for the lack of criticism may be simple. White folk have no corner on the straight hair market, as witnessed by Asian and Latino follicles. Jacobs exposed his unconscious bias when he, of course, tried to claim the opposite. I don't see color or race, I see people. Too bad that so many white folk believe that pretending not to see race is the way to address racism, and that when they get caught seeing race for their advantage, as in using the natural hairstyles of black folk, they claim not to see race to their advantage. Jacobs overlooks the point that black folk wearing their hair in locks at work is often seen as inappropriate. Dreadlocks are widely viewed as incompatible with our nation's business culture. Black folk can't choose to wear their hair in locks and get work, an option that only white folk appear capable of choosing. Basically, Mark Jacobs wants us to shut up and not notice that he's ripping off black culture. He is inspired by us and pays homage to us in a supposedly non-racial fashion, while he refuses to see color. You see how this can so quickly go south? How about just giving credit where credit is due? The irony is that well-meaning white folk like Mark Jacobs draw their inspiration from a misreading of the civil rights movement and the example of Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights movement that inspired King, that he inspired in turn, has been appropriated too, and often in troubling ways. We end up with a greatly compromised view of the black freedom struggle. In the narrative of American history, especially the kind told in our nation's textbooks, the movement didn't seek racial justice as much as it sought a race-neutral society. American history hugs color blindness. If you can't see race, you certainly can't see racial responsibility. You can simply remain blind to your own advantages. When some of you say, I don't see color, you are either well-intending naifs or willful race evaders. In either case, you don't help the cause. The failure to see color only benefits white America. A world without color is a world without racial debt. One of the greatest privileges of whiteness is not to see color, not to see race, and not to pay a price for ignoring it, except, of course, when you're called on it. But even then, that price pales, quite literally, in comparison to the high price black folk pay for being black. We pay a price, too, for not even being able to derive recognition and financial reward for the styles that make the world want to be black so bad that they don't mind looking like us as long as they never, ever have to be us. If the appropriators can freely rip off our culture with no consequences, those who revise racial history, the fourth stage of white racial grief, are even less accountable for their deeds. The way of the racial revisionists when it comes to black life in history is simply to rewrite it. Their motto is, it didn't happen that way. There is a flood of writing that tells us that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, but about the effort to defend states' rights. But, my friends, you've got to put yourself in our place and see the absurdity of such a claim. Defend the right of the state to do what? To enslave blacks. But even here, the irresistible logic of whiteness, that is, irresistible to whites themselves and to all of us who are subject to white whim, springs into full action. White American history is so powerful that even when it loses, it wins, at least in skirmishes within whiteness itself. From the right wing, there is the belief that the Civil War was fought over the ability of individual states to beat back a federal government out to impose its will. From the left wing, there's the belief that the Civil War was a conflict between the planter class and the proletariat. In each case, race as the main reason for the war is skillfully rewritten, or really, written out. Slavery is rewritten too. Some white Christian apologists contended that black folk needed slavery to save their souls or to rescue their cultures. A contemporary twist on this argument radiates in thinkers like Dinesh D'Souza, who claims that American blacks brought here through slavery are now doing far better than their African kin. Some white critics argue that since blacks sold other blacks into slavery, bondage was a black man's problem, not a white man's burden. But revisionists would much rather describe the dehumanization of black folk as little more than a commercial transaction. It's another way of washing their hands of racial responsibility. The effort to rewrite history surfaces in how Malcolm X is treated in the mainstream. It hardly seems likely that the culture he fought with all his heart could be depended on to grasp his true meaning. Malcolm is often read as an apostle of violence, as a frightful figure consumed by destructive rage. Yet the truth is far more complex, and Malcolm was far more complicated. But isn't the autobiography of Malcolm X so enduringly appealing because it shows Malcolm X giving up on hatred as a means to racial justice? Malcolm X believed in the liberation of black folk from the mental and psychological chains of white supremacy. He was not committed to nonviolence as a way of life or a method of social strategy. He believed that such a commitment prevents the full realization of black emancipation. Yet he was not personally violent. As Ossie Davis said in his eulogy, responding to the claim that Malcolm preached hate and was a fanatic and a racist, "Did you even talk to Brother Malcolm? Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance?" The rage that flowed in Malcolm's veins was the rage against a force of whiteness that aimed to wash its black kin from the face of the earth. The urge to rewrite black history occasionally gives way to the final stage of white racial grief, which is simply, when it comes to race, to dilute it. That is, to argue that bad stuff doesn't just plague black folk. To summarize, bad stuff happened to everyone. This argument surfaced in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The storm certainly hit black folk, but it hit white folk too. This is the sordid version of reverse American exceptionalism. It is the same Me Too impulse that flares in the bitter battle against affirmative action. Beloved, I can't help but notice that affirmative action is the bee in so many of your bonnets. You look around in your classrooms and you think every black person is there because they got an unfair shake from the system. You look at your job and you think that your black coworker got an unjust nod of approval from the powers that be. You never stop to think how the history of whiteness in America is one long scroll of affirmative action. You never stop to think that Babe Ruth never had to play the greatest players of his generation, just the greatest white players. You never stop to think that most of our presidents never rose to the top because they bested the competition, just the white competition. White privilege is a self-selecting tool that keeps you from having to compete with the best. The history of white folk gaining access to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale is the history of white folk deciding ahead of the game that you were superior. You argue that slots in schools should be reserved for your kin because, after all, they are smarter, more disciplined, better suited, and more deserving than inferior blacks. That's like concluding that the Cleveland Cavaliers can't possibly win the NBA championship because they are down 3-1 to the Golden State Warriors. Throw in the towel and call it a series, but they must play the series to determine the winner. Whiteness is having all the advantages on your side, the referees blowing the whistle for you, the arena packed with only your fans. In fact, whiteness means you never even have to play the game at all, at least not in head-to-head matchups with the talent and skill of black folk. You've been handed a history where you got most of the land, made most of the money, got most of the presumptions of goodness and innocence and intelligence and thrift and genius and just about everything that is edifying and white. So it's hard to stomach your gripes about the few concessions, surely not advantages, to black folk and other folk of color that are suggested in affirmative action. And the irony is that, in aggregate, when we add in white women and other abled folk, it is white folk who are the overwhelming beneficiaries of affirmative action. That makes it sound like malarkey when so many of you complain that you aren't being treated fairly either. You say that our demand for justice causes you unjust suffering. You think you miss out on jobs that go to less qualified blacks. That may be one of the greatest claims to collective self-pity known to mankind. And yet you, with straight faces, keep telling black folk and others that we're the ones throwing self-pity parties around the country. There is more, beloved. If black folk hurt because of race, you say you hurt because of class. Many of you can't see that race makes class hurt more. And when many of you claim that black folks shouldn't get affirmative action, that the kids of, say, Barack Obama or some rich black person shouldn't get a bid for a job or a space in a classroom usually reserved for white folk, you miss a crucial fact. Wealthy blacks didn't get a pass from Jim Crow. Well-to-do blacks don't get an exemption from racism. Of course, our status mostly protects us from the worst that you can do to most of us, but it doesn't stop us as a class of folk from being denied opportunities that our smarts and our success should have guaranteed. Another way you dilute black history is to make yourselves the heroes of our struggles. You argue that there have always been good white folk helping us out. Let's just call it dilution through distortion. It is the sting of noblesse oblige. Just look at the movies. Films about slavery must feature a sympathetic white character who wants black folk to be free. John Quincy Adams must be the real hero of Amistad, since Sin-Q couldn't rebel effectively without help from his great white defenders. Ghosts of Mississippi, about the murder of Medgar Evers, highlights the heroic white prosecutor, Bobby DeLauder, who fought to open the case, and much less the brave black widow, Myrlie Evers, who fought white supremacy to make sure he paid attention. Mississippi Burning, supposedly about the killing of 3 civil rights workers in the 60s, celebrates 2 white FBI agents, heroes in a state where white terror rarely had better allies than silent white law enforcement or brutal local police. If such portrayals might be laid at the feet of last century's retrograde racial politics, the present is also flush with white savior movies. In Free State of Jones, Matthew McConaughey plays real-life figure Newton Knight, a poor farmer from Jones County, Mississippi, who galvanized a group of white army deserters and escaped enslaved folk against the Confederacy during the Civil War. And in Freedom Riders, Hilary Swank plays a white teacher in Long Beach in the mid-90s who educates non-white high school students in the midst of inner-city hardship. With white friends like that, black folk need no heroes of their own. My friends, we cannot deny that white folk of conscience were of enormous help to the cause of black struggle. Black and white folk often form dynamic partnerships to combat racial inequality. But too often white folk want to be treated with kid gloves or treated like adolescents who can't take the truth of grown-up racial history. So we have to spoon-feed you that truth and put your white faces in our stories to make you see them, perhaps like them, or at least to consider them legitimate and worthy of your attention. Appealing to your ego to protect our backsides, that's the bargain many of us are forced to make. Beloved, it's not just on the silver screen where you dilute and distort our history. In everyday life, the refusal to engage black folk tells on you through your exaggerated sense of insult where none should exist. Many of you are shocked that black folk have taken to reminding you that Black Lives Matter. Some of you are just peeved, but others of you are enraged. That's because you're used to distorting and diluting our history without much frontal challenge. You fail to realize that the nation has already set the standard for determining which lives matter and which don't. Black lives were excluded from the start. The reason Black Lives Matter needs to be shouted is because American history ignored black history, didn't tell black stories. The founding documents of American society didn't include black life. When black folks say Black Lives Matter, they are in search of simple recognition that they are decent human beings, that they aren't likely to commit crimes, that they're reasonably smart, that they're no more evil than the next person, that they're willing to work hard to get ahead, that they love their kids and want them to do better than they did, that they are loving and kind and compassionate, and that they should be treated with the same respect that the average, nondescript, unexceptional white male routinely receives without fanfare or the expectation of gratitude in return. To argue that we matter is not to deny that there are things about us that have always mattered more than they should, especially how we look. Black folk now glory in what was once the source of our grief, our black skin. And yet the phenotypic differences among the races have made our culture stand out. With us, history was altered by color. Our skin, the economy of the epidermis, permits white America to dismiss us by differentiating us. But the world we made together, the history we forged in conflicted Congress, bears forever the mark of our offending yet transformative blackness. Our history, black history, has been denied, but it has never really been invisible. In fact, we have always been the most visible thing about America. Everyone else, all of your kin, the white immigrants, assimilated. But by virtue of our very skin color, we stood out. Ironically, the very thing that bound us to slavery also made it impossible for us to hide, to assimilate, to pass gently out of an outmoded institution. American history is the history of black subjugation. The Constitution is a racially hypocritical work of genius. The North and South are divided because of us. The history of the 20th century in America is the history of our struggle against white America. And yet nowhere, apart from South Africa under apartheid, is the omission of black folk from history as glaring an omission. Our presence is so saturating, so embedded, so inextricable, that white America's most reactionary racist identities revolve around us. The Klan rally is grievous testimony to ineradicable black identity. And the most intimate and industrious spaces in white America, from the kitchen to the construction site, rest on our labor. There is no getting around blackness. In slavery, it was the intensity of our proximity, of white and black, that defined us. In that sense, whiteness and blackness are an American invention. Our agency, our story, is linked to your history, your story, black and white together. Beloved, you must give up myths about yourself, about your history, that you are resolutely individual and not part of a group, that you pulled yourselves up by your bootstraps. You must also forcefully and finally come face to face with the black America you have insisted on seeing through stereotype and fear. Whiteness can no longer afford to hog the world to itself or claim that its burdens are the burdens of the universe. You must repent of your whiteness, which means repenting of your catastrophic investment in false grievances and artificial claims of injury. You must reject the easy scapegoating of black folk for white failures, white disappointments, and white exploitation.